The day the Galactic Council gathered to vote on Earth's future felt strangely quiet, even though billions of lives were about to be affected. In the wide halls of the Central Dome, representatives from every corner of the galaxy sat behind shimmering panels that displayed their homeworld symbols. Some looked calm. Some looked nervous. A few avoided making eye contact with the human envoy standing in the center of the room. Everyone knew the vote would change the relationship between Earth and the rest of the galaxy forever. The human envoy tried to stay steady, but inside, a heavy mix of frustration and disbelief churned. For years, humans had worked hard to build peaceful relations with the Council. They had shared technology, sent aid missions, and honored every agreement. Yet now, whispers and rumors had turned into something dangerous. Other species claimed humans were growing too ambitious, too unpredictable, and too fast in their progress. None of these things were crimes, but they made the Council uneasy. And when powerful species felt uneasy, decisions often became unfair. As the quiet spread across the hall, the Council speaker rose. His tall frame cast a long shadow across the polished floor. His voice echoed through the chamber, calm but cold. He announced that the vote would begin, and each species would decide whether Earth could remain part of the inner systems or be exiled to the distant outer rim. The words hit like a physical shock. Exile was usually reserved for dangerous empires that broke treaties or caused wars. Earth had done neither. Humanity had simply advanced quicker than others liked. Screens lit up as each delegation cast its vote. The human envoy watched the numbers appear one by one. A few allies voted in favor of Earth staying. That gave a moment of hope. But then, one after another, the red symbols appeared, marking a vote for exile. Some faces looked apologetic, others indifferent, and a few seemed almost satisfied. It was clear the outcome had already been decided long before the meeting began. Humans had never stood a real chance. When the final vote was displayed, the hall stayed silent. The decision was clear. Earth was removed from the central systems. The envoy felt something inside break, not with anger, but with disappointment. All the years spent building trust had collapsed in a single moment because others feared what humans might become. As the speaker declared the decision official, the human envoy stepped back, realizing there was nothing left to say. Arguing would not change minds that were already closed. Back on Earth, the news spread faster than anyone expected. Every screen, radio, and public square began broadcasting the announcement. People stood still, listening in disbelief. The idea of exile sounded unreal, like something that belonged in an old story rather than real life. Some reacted with anger, others with shock, and many simply felt hurt. They had believed cooperation was the path forward. They had believed the galaxy saw them as partners. Now they learned the truth. They were seen as a threat. The streets of major cities filled with conversations. Neighbors gathered outside, trying to understand what this meant for their future. Will trade routes be closed? Will ships be banned from traveling? Will borders tighten around Earth? Every question made people worry more. Families wondered how they would survive without access to resources that came from the inner systems. Students wondered if their dreams of joining galactic science academies were over. Workers in space industries feared losing their jobs. Leaders across the planet appeared on screens, trying to calm the rising anxiety. They explained that exile did not mean attack or imprisonment. It meant relocation, isolation, and self-reliance. Humans would need to leave the central systems and move toward the far edges of the galaxy. They would no longer be allowed to remain in areas controlled by the Council. It was a challenge, unlike anything Earth had faced before, but not impossible. If people stayed united, not many citizens felt angry at the unfairness of the decision. But beneath that anger was also something quieter and deeper: sadness. Humanity had always fought its internal struggles, But when it came to the galaxy, it tried to be honest and helpful. To be rejected so suddenly, without any real wrongdoing, felt like betrayal. People didn't understand why the Council was afraid. They weren't seeking dominance. They were simply trying to grow, to explore, and to find their place in the universe like everyone else. The following days were filled with meetings and strategy discussions. Scientists worked with engineers to figure out how to move a massive portion of Earth's population. Pilots reviewed space routes that led toward the outer rim. Leaders debated how many ships would be needed, how much food and water must be packed, and which technology was safe to bring. Every department on Earth began preparing for the largest relocation in human history. Yet even in the middle of all this planning, ordinary people had to make personal decisions. Some gathered their belongings, unsure what to take and what to leave behind. Some cried quietly as they packed memories into small boxes. Others tried to stay optimistic, telling themselves this could be a new beginning. But no matter how hopeful they tried to sound, the fear of the unknown still lingered in their eyes. The elders on Earth, who had lived through past generations of conflict and progress, reminded everyone that humans had always survived difficult times. They spoke about how earlier generations rebuilt after disasters, united during global crises, and learned to live beyond their fears. They told stories of scientists who changed the world with nothing but determination and explorers who crossed oceans without knowing what awaited them. Their words helped calm the younger ones who felt overwhelmed. Slowly, the bitterness on the planet began to shift into something else. People realized that being exiled did not mean losing dignity. It didn't erase everything humans had achieved. If anything, it forced them to confront a question they had avoided. Could humanity build a future without approval from powerful species? Could they stand strong on their own? Even the human envoy, who had returned from the council meeting with a heavy heart, started to believe this exile might become a turning point instead of an ending. The envoy described what it felt like standing alone in the hall, watching the council turn its back. But instead of letting that moment crush them, the envoy encouraged others to use it as motivation. If the galaxy didn't want humans near its center, then humans would build something better on the edge. Meanwhile, the council members carried on with their daily routines, believing they had made a wise and cautious decision. They discussed trade matters, border disputes, and scientific research as though nothing significant had happened. To them, Earth was now a small issue handled and set aside. They did not imagine that their choice would push humans into becoming stronger, more united, and more determined than ever before. Back on Earth, the nights felt different. People gathered on rooftops and hilltops, staring at the stars for longer than usual. Every light in the sky seemed like a reminder of what they were leaving behind. But it also looked like a map of endless possibilities. The outer rim was vast, unpredictable, and filled with mystery. It was a place the council rarely bothered with. Some saw that as a curse. Others saw it as freedom. Parents told their children that the stars they were heading toward were not to be feared. They described them as new worlds waiting to be explored, new homes waiting to be built, and new challenges that would test human courage. Children listened with wide eyes, sensing that something big was coming, even if they didn't fully understand it. As the final preparations continued, the atmosphere on Earth slowly changed from sadness to determination. People worked day and night, helping one another build the ships, load supplies, and plan the journey. Pilots trained harder. Engineers double-checked every system. Farmers learned new methods to grow crops in space habitats. Everyone had a role. Everyone felt responsible for the future. By the end of the week, one truth had become clear across Earth. Exile would not be the end of humanity. It would be the beginning of a new chapter 1, written not by fear, but by resilience. Even though thousands of questions remained unanswered and countless challenges waited ahead, The human spirit had begun to rise again. What the Council saw as punishment, humanity began to see as opportunity. And although no one could predict what the Outer Rim would hold, one thing was certain: they would face it together. The day the great departure began arrived sooner than anyone expected. The preparations on Earth had been moving non-stop, factories producing engine parts, engineers rewiring transport ships, families packing only what they truly needed. Yet, when the morning finally came, most people felt like they weren't ready at all. How could anyone be ready to leave the only home they had ever known? Across the planet, long lines of ships waited at spaceports. Some were old cargo carriers refurbished for travel. Others were newly built vessels created specifically for this journey. People walked in groups, carrying bags, cases, or small boxes filled with memories. Some held onto old photographs. Some carried a favorite book or a childhood object they couldn't leave behind. Others brought nothing sentimental at all, choosing instead to focus on tools, supplies, and food for the long trip ahead. In every city, the air felt heavy with emotion. People hugged each other tightly, even strangers. There were no big arguments or loud complaints, just quiet acceptance mixed with a strong sense of unity. Everyone knew the journey would be long, and no one could say when they might see Earth again, if ever. Some whispered that they hoped the planet would heal in their absence. Others worried it would feel empty. But most tried not to think too far ahead. There was already too much to take in. The first wave of ships lifted off just after sunrise. Bright trails of light stretched across the sky as engines ignited. The sound echoed through valleys and over oceans, leaving millions watching in silence. Humanity was not just moving a few hundred people into space. It was moving whole communities, entire research teams, medical units, workers, students, and families. It was the largest relocation ever attempted in known history, and everyone hoped it would be successful. Inside the ships, the atmosphere was a mix of fear and determination. Space travel was not new to humans, but traveling so far into uncharted regions was something different. The routes toward the Outer Rim were long and rarely used. Most Council species avoided them because they were unpredictable. There were stories about strange gravitational waves, unexplained signals, and drifting debris fields left behind from old cosmic events. But humans didn't have the luxury of choosing safe routes anymore. They had to take the path they were given. As the fleet moved farther from Earth, people gathered in viewing rooms to take one last look at their planet. The blue oceans, the white clouds, the shapes of continents. They had seen these images many times before, but this time they looked different. This time, they were not just looking. They were saying goodbye. Some pressed their hands against the glass. Some cried silently, and some simply stared, letting the beauty of Earth sink into their memory. Even those who had dreamed of exploring deep space felt a strange pain at leaving home behind. The first week of the journey passed with a mix of hard work and quiet moments. Engineers checked the engines constantly, adjusting systems to keep everything stable. Medical teams walked through the halls, making sure passengers were healthy. Kids tried to entertain themselves in small play areas made for the trip. Adults took turns preparing meals in makeshift kitchens that floated slightly every time the ship changed direction. Life in space required patience, flexibility, and a sense of humor, and slowly, people began adapting, but the trip was far from peaceful. On the 10th day, the fleet encountered a massive energy storm. Bright arcs of light flashed outside the windows as the ships shook violently. People gripped their seats, trying to stay calm, as alarms echoed through the corridors. Some lights flickered, engines strained, and communication screens went dark for a few minutes. Those few minutes felt like hours. Parents tried to reassure children, though their own hearts raced with fear. When the storm finally passed, the captains reported the damage. A few ships had minor cracks in their outer panels. One had lost part of its navigation system. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the scare reminded everyone how fragile their situation was. They were deep in space now, far from any help. If something went truly wrong, there would be no rescue team. They only had themselves. Despite the challenges, something interesting began happening on board. People started forming small communities. Those who once lived in different cities or continents now shared meals and stories. They talked about their reasons for volunteering to leave Earth. Some came because they felt it was their duty. Some came because they wanted a chance to start fresh. Some came simply because their families had no choice. These conversations helped people understand one another better. The journey wasn't just about reaching the outer rim. It was about learning to survive together. One night, an engineer taught children how gravity worked using balls that floated in the air. The kids laughed as they chased them around the room. A group of elders gathered in a corner, telling stories of old Earth traditions. Some young workers learned how to repair life support systems, even though they had never touched such equipment before. Space had a way of turning everyone into learners, teachers, and helpers. During the third week, food supplies became a challenge. Some of the storage units malfunctioned, causing part of the produce to freeze solid. People worked quickly to salvage what they could. Cooking teams adjusted meal plans, rationing some ingredients and creating simple dishes from what remained. Instead of complaining, many passengers volunteered to help. They understood that the mission mattered more than personal comfort. And in a strange way, these small struggles made the community stronger. The voyage also gave people time to think, something many had rarely done back on Earth. Without the constant noise of daily life, without endless schedules or crowded streets, people began reflecting on what the exile meant. Some realized they had spent years taking things for granted. Others felt grateful for the chance to remake their world. And some were still angry at the council, but even that anger started to change. Instead of bitterness, it turned into motivation, a desire to prove that humanity could rise despite everything. On the fourth week, the fleet reached an ancient waypoint known as the Silent Observatory. It was a lonely outpost floating between systems, built long ago by an unknown species. Most council members never visited because it offered nothing, no trade, no resources, no strategic value. But for the human fleet, it was a symbol of hope. Captain after captain reported that the observatory's energy readings matched their maps, confirming they were on the right path. People gathered near the windows again, staring at the structure. It looked abandoned, with faint lights flickering across its surface, but somehow it felt welcoming, like a reminder that even in the farthest places, life had once existed. Some passengers whispered that maybe one day humans would build their own observatories across the rim bright, busy and full of knowledge. As the fleet pushed forward, they entered regions where the stars grew fewer and the space felt quiet. The outer rim lay ahead like a dark unknown waiting to be explored. People felt a mix of fear and excitement. They knew the planets there might be harsh, the weather unpredictable, the resources limited. But they also knew this was their chance to build something new without restrictions, without judgment, without being underestimated. Toward the end of the journey, something unexpected happened. The oldest passengers began giving small speeches each evening. They talked about resilience, unity, patience, and the importance of remembering who they were. They reminded everyone that humans had faced hardship before wars, disasters, divisions, and yet they always found a way to rebuild. Listening to these words brought comfort to many who felt anxious about the future. Finally, after weeks of travel, the fleet received the first clear signals from the outer rim. The stars grew brighter again, scattered across the sky in new shapes and patterns. Strange colors glowed in nebula clouds that no one from Earth had ever seen before. The captains announced that the colonies were close, and a wave of relief spread through the ships. People stood at the windows, staring ahead with wide eyes. They weren't returning to what they lost. They were heading toward what they would create. The journey had tested them in every way, but it had also changed them. It taught them that strength doesn't come from comfort. It comes from facing the unknown together. By the time the fleet approached the first planet on their charts, humanity no longer felt like they were running from exile. They felt like they were moving toward a new beginning, one shaped by courage, unity, and hope. And this was only the start of what the Outer Rim would reveal. When the fleet finally entered the Outer Rim, the first feeling everyone shared was surprise. They had expected the region to look dark, empty, and lifeless, because that was what the Council always described. Instead, the space around them glowed with unusual colors, and distant planets shimmered with light, bouncing off strange minerals. It felt wild, untouched, and full of secrets waiting to be discovered. That the first world chosen for landing looked rough from space, its surface covered in rocky plains, uneven mountains, and thick clouds that moved in unpredictable patterns. Many passengers stared at it quietly, wondering if they could really build a life there. But the captains assured them this world was rich in resources, and its air could be filtered for human use. It wasn't perfect, but it was a place to begin. When the first ships landed, the ground shook gently, and a layer of dust lifted into the air. People stepped out slowly, some feeling unsteady after weeks of living in artificial gravity. The air outside felt strange, not harmful, but different enough to make them breathe carefully at first. The sky was a deep shade of violet, unlike anything they had ever seen on Earth. Large, uneven rocks stood scattered across the plains like ancient sculptures carved by nature itself. There was no welcoming music, no soft breeze, and no comfortable buildings already waiting. Just open land, tough soil, and endless work ahead. But strangely, that reality didn't scare them. It reminded them of old stories from Earth, about early explorers who built new homes for nothing. Many imagined their ancestors facing forests, storms, deserts, and oceans with far fewer tools than they had now. That thought gave them courage. The first days were a mix of excitement and exhaustion. Workers set up temporary shelters made from collapsible metal frames and transparent panels. Scientists took samples of the soil, water, and plants to ensure nothing was dangerous. Engineers installed filtration systems so people could breathe easily inside the shelters. Everyone had a role. No one was useless here. Families slept close together at night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds outside. The wind on this planet had a low hum, and sometimes it carried distant echoes that no one could identify. It wasn't scary, just mysterious. The stars were brighter than on Earth, and instead of one moon, the sky had 3. Each cast its own color across the land: pale blue, soft gold, and faint green, giving the night a magical glow. As days passed, the temporary shelters expanded into a small settlement. People built walkways made of strong plastic boards, stacked cargo crates into storage towers, and used solar panels to power their machines. They didn't have the comfort of cities, but they had safety, order, and a growing sense of belonging. The biggest challenge came with farming. The soil was rich, but it didn't behave like Earth soil. It absorbed water faster and dried out in patches. The first crops they planted struggled. Leaves curled oddly, and some plants grew sideways, as if reaching for a different kind of sunlight. But instead of giving up, the farming team studied every detail. They adjusted the minerals in the soil, built small greenhouses to control the temperature, and experimented with water cycles. After many long days, the first successful crop emerged small, bright fruits with thick skin and a flavor unlike anything from Earth. People cheered when they tasted them. It wasn't about the fruit. It was about hope. Of course, not everything went smoothly. A powerful storm hit the settlement one afternoon. Dark clouds rolled in faster than anyone expected, and violent winds shook the shelters. The sky turned nearly black as lightning flashed across the horizon. People rushed to secure equipment and hold down panels that threatened to fly off. For a moment, it felt like the storm might tear everything apart. But humans didn't panic. They had survived storms on Earth far worse than this. Engineers worked side by side with volunteers, sealing weak spots and covering important structures. By the time the storm passed, there was damaged broken panels, scattered supplies, but nothing that couldn't be repaired. And more importantly, no one was harmed. The storm had tested them, but it also proved they could face anything this new world threw at them. Over time, the settlement began to truly grow. Not just physically, but emotionally. People started to feel proud of every small success. A group of young people built the first communication tower using spare ship parts. Technicians created a small dome where kids could play safely without breathing filters. Artists began carving shapes into local stones, turning them into simple decorations for the settlement. These decorations didn't solve any practical problems, but they brought comfort, warmth, and a sense of humanity. Then came the discovery that changed everything. A group of explorers traveled a few kilometers away from the settlement to study the terrain. What they found was breathtaking: a hidden valley filled with glowing plants that lit up the ground in soft blue light. There were tall crystals rising from the earth, almost transparent, reflecting the lights like mirrors. Water flowed through the valley, clear and smooth, creating a soft sound that echoed gently through the space. When they returned with samples, scientists realized the valley had minerals unlike anything found in the inner systems. These minerals could power machines more efficiently than most fuels. They were rare, valuable, and possibly useful for building stronger technology. For the first time since exile, humans felt they had discovered something that could not only help them survive, but help them thrive. Soon, teams were sent to study the valley more closely. They didn't rush to extract everything, because they understood the value of respecting nature. Instead, they worked slowly, learning how the ecosystem functioned. They wanted to build a future, not destroy resources. This careful approach impressed even the most skeptical people in the settlement. Another challenge came when strange creatures appeared near the outer sensors. They looked nothing like Earth animals: thin bodies, shimmering skin, and large eyes that reflected the moonlight. At first, people were frightened. They didn't know if the creatures were dangerous. But after watching them closely, scientists discovered they were harmless. They didn't attack or approach humans. They simply observed from a distance and then disappeared into the rocks. Their presence reminded humans that they were not alone in this world, even if the creatures didn't communicate. As months passed, the settlement transformed into something that felt almost like a small town. People built stronger homes using local materials, mapped safe routes across the plains, and set up more greenhouses for food. They even created a small gathering area where they held evening meetings, shared stories, and planned the future. When they looked around, they no longer saw exile. They saw opportunity. Life was still hard. Supplies were limited, the environment was unpredictable, and every day brought new challenges. But humans felt an unusual strength growing between them. The outer rim didn't break their spirit, it sharpened it. They realized they didn't need approval from the council or protection from powerful species. They had each other, their skills, and their determination. One night, as people gathered near the edge of the settlement, someone pointed at the sky. A faint line of light drifted across the horizon. It was another one of humanity's ships arriving with more families, more workers, more dreams. The settlement cheered. They were no longer just surviving. They were building a home that would welcome others. The outer rim was tough, wild, and unpredictable, but it was also full of potential. And slowly, Piece by piece, humans were learning how to turn that potential into reality. What began as exile was becoming something far greater, a new beginning shaped by courage, teamwork, and the belief that even the harshest lands can bloom if people refuse to give up. The early years in the Outer Rim were shaped by struggle, but what came afterward was shaped by growth. The settlement that had once been just a handful of shelters and temporary structures slowly transformed to something much bigger than anyone expected. It began with small victories, but those victories added up day by day, until humanity realized it had created more than a place to survive. It had created a new identity. At first, the changes were subtle. The greenhouses became more advanced, producing not only basic crops, but also new fruits that grew well in the rim soil. Engineers began modifying old ship engines to run on the valley's mineral crystals, which turned out to be surprisingly efficient. These engines didn't make loud noises or release heavy smoke. They hummed softly, like they were in tune with the rhythm of the land. People said the engines felt alive, though no one meant it literally. They just admired how smoothly they ran. Over time, humans developed a new style of construction. Instead of replicating earth buildings, they used rim materials, smooth stones from the valleys, flexible metal-like vines found near the riverbanks, and sand that hardened into solid blocks when pressed under heat. The buildings looked different from anything seen in the inner systems. They had curved walls, wide skylights, and structures that blended naturally with the terrain. Some visitors from nearby independent colonies later said the human settlements looked like they were grown, not built. This uniqueness became a source of pride. The settlement leaders never used official titles. They didn't want strict ranks or old-fashioned authority. Instead, they held open meetings where anyone could speak. People shared their ideas freely. Teachers, mechanics, students, elders, and even kids who had lived most of their lives in space. This open style of decision-making made everyone feel important. They didn't need a council to judge them. They judged themselves, and they took that responsibility seriously. As more ships arrived from Earth, the settlement expanded into multiple zones connected by long walkways. One zone was dedicated to farming, another to energy production, another to housing, and one large area became a community space where people gathered for celebrations, meetings, or just quiet evenings. Lantern-like lights, powered by small mineral cells, glowed gently across the pathways at night. The Outer Rim's 3 moons cast beautiful shadows over the land, making the settlement look calm and surreal. Humans also began exploring beyond the First World. Using modified scout ships, small teams visited other nearby planets. Some were too dangerous, covered in acidic storms or unstable ground. Others were beautiful, but lacked resources. But a few showed promise. People collected samples, recorded data, and marked safe landing areas. They didn't rush to colonize everything. They moved carefully, respecting each place before deciding if it could support life. Trade slowly began with nearby independent species who lived outside the Council's rule. These groups had heard rumors that humans were building something quietly powerful in the far edges of space. They came to see for themselves, expecting to find either chaos or desperation. But what they found surprised them. Humans were organized, hardworking, and honest in their dealings. They didn't demand alliances or show arrogance. They simply offered fair exchanges, crystals for food, technology for raw materials, and knowledge for knowledge. The visitors left with respect and sometimes admiration. Some species even asked if they could learn the new farming techniques humans had developed. Others were curious about the mineral-based engines. A few, who had once been ignored by the inner galaxy, appreciated how humans treated them not as inferior races, but as equals. The Rim became a place where forgotten species connected, shared stories, and traded peacefully. and humanity played a central role in holding these relationships together. Interestingly, many humans noticed they were becoming more patient. Life in the Rim didn't allow for laziness or wastefulness. It demanded attention, courage, and unity. People learned to adapt quickly to sudden changes in weather. They learned to repair almost anything because imported parts were rare. They learned to treat every resource with care, whether it was clean water, fresh food, or the energy crystals they depended on. Children who grew up in the Rim saw the galaxy differently from their parents. They weren't angry about the exile. They didn't miss the Council's inner systems. To them, the Rim was home full of adventure, mystery, and freedom. They climbed the rocky cliffs, played among glowing plants, and learned to navigate by the three moons. Some said they preferred Rim nights to Earth nights because the air felt cooler, the stars felt closer, and the quiet wrapped around them like a soft blanket dot as humanity strengthened. Word began to travel, not through official channels, but through rumors whispered across spaceports, mining stations, and wandering trader ships. The rumors spoke of humans who worked with impossible minerals, who built new technology in makeshift workshops, who survived harsh conditions without complaining, and who created peace in a region known for instability. This story reached races that once feared humans. Some doubted the rumors. Others admitted they may have misjudged Earth long ago. A few began to see humans not as threats, but as pioneers. Meanwhile, in the settlement, progress didn't slow down. People discovered a second mineral source deep underground. It took weeks of careful drilling and surveying, but this new mineral had a unique property. It stored solar energy far more efficiently than traditional batteries. Scientists were stunned. They created prototype chargers that absorbed sunlight during the day and could power entire buildings at night. Got this advancement changed everything. Suddenly, the settlement no longer needed backup generators. Lights stayed on all night without flickering. Machines ran smoothly. Food preservation became easier. Medical devices worked with full stability. People celebrated the breakthrough with a large gathering in the community space, sharing food, dancing, and telling stories under the three moons. For many, it was the first time they truly felt proud of their exile. They didn't just survive, they achieved something meaningful. But even as success grew, people never forgot the early struggles. They carried those memories as reminders to stay humble and united. They taught the younger generation about the storm that nearly destroyed the settlement, the crops that initially failed, and the fragile days when no one knew if the Rim would welcome or reject them. These stories were told not to create fear, but to build gratitude. One evening, while workers were strengthening a new communication tower, someone asked a simple question. What would the council say if they could see this now? A quiet laughter spread among the workers. Not bitter laughter, just amused. The truth was, the council was still unaware of humanity's progress. They believed exile had pushed humans out of sight and out of mind. They never imagined humanity had built communities, formed alliances, created new technology, and earned respect from Rim species. Some people joked that the council would panic. Others said the council would be confused. A few believed the council would pretend none of this mattered. But deep down, many humans knew the truth. The council underestimated them. Maybe they always had. As more months passed, humanity grew even more confident. The Rim was no longer a place to fear. It became a place where they felt strong, independent, and hopeful. People created music inspired by the sounds of Rim winds. Artists painted landscapes showing glowing valleys and triple moons. Teachers developed new subjects that focused on Rim ecology and mineral energy. The culture of the Outer Rim humanity began to feel distinct, still connected to Earth, but proudly different. One day, a group of travelers from a distant species approached the settlement with a surprising message. They said that other parts of the rim were looking toward the human settlements as an example of how to build peaceful communities. They asked for guidance, cooperation, and knowledge sharing. Humans welcomed them warmly. The visitors left feeling inspired, and word of this kindness spread even farther. Humanity, once exiled and rejected, had become a quiet center of stability in the unpredictable rim dot as time went on. People realized something important. They no longer cared about proving themselves to the council. They didn't need acceptance. They didn't need permission. Everything they had built came from their own hands, their own ideas, and their own willingness to work together. Exile had turned them into pioneers. The rim had turned them into leaders. And every sunrise across the violet sky reminded them that they were exactly where they needed to be. When the settlements in the outer rim had finally started to look stable, people thought the hardest days were over. The houses were stronger, farms were growing better crops. The weather no longer surprised them as much. And the new generation of children had already learned how to live under 2 suns or 3 moons without fear. After years of struggle, humanity had finally found a rhythm. Life was still tough, but it was no longer a fight for survival every single day. But the outer rim was never a place that stayed calm for long. The people living there knew deep down that challenges would come again, because the rim had its own rules. Space itself felt wild, alive, unpredictable. And soon, the peace they had worked so hard to build began to shake. It started with a strange signal. It wasn't a message, and it didn't sound like anything natural. It came from deep space, far beyond the settlements. At first, the engineers thought it was a glitch, maybe a reflection from a passing meteor or a broken communications tower. But the signal kept repeating. It had a pulse to it, slow, steady, and cold. Something had noticed them. The leaders of the colonies gathered in a simple metal hall built at the center of the main settlement. It wasn't fancy. The lights flickered sometimes, and the chairs didn't match, but it was enough for meetings. People sat quietly, waiting to hear what the experts had discovered. One of the engineers stood up and explained that the signal wasn't from nature and wasn't from any friendly settlement. It was coming from a group known in whispers across the rim raiders who lived on stolen ships, drifting from place to place, attacking anyone they thought was weak. They never communicated clearly. Instead, they used signals like this to mark possible targets. The moment this news spread, fear touched the colony. No one wanted to go back to living in danger. They had already survived storms, hunger, diseases, and unstable land. After all that, facing raiders felt like a test they didn't ask for. The worry grew stronger when some ships traveling between settlements reported strange shadows following them in deep space. People began to stay inside at night, locking doors even though there had never been a crime problem before. But humans had changed since their exile. They were not the same people who had walked out of the Galactic Council Hall feeling defeated. The rim had taught them to adapt, to think differently, to stand together. So instead of panicking, they prepared. Groups of volunteers stepped forward. They were not soldiers, just farmers, builders, mechanics, and teachers, but life in the rim had taught everyone a little bit about survival. They trained together, learned how to handle emergency situations, and studied how raiders fought. They used old ships waiting in scrapyards and turned them into fast, small patrol craft. What they lacked in firepower, they made up for with creativity and teamwork. Meanwhile, the settlements strengthened their defenses. Walls were reinforced with local minerals that were surprisingly strong. Watchtowers were built on high ground. Communication lines were upgraded so every colony could talk to each other instantly. Even the children learned what to do if an alarm ever sounded, not to scare them, but to keep them safe. Weeks passed quietly. The signal continued, like a drumbeat in the background, reminding them that the threat was still coming. Then one night, As the sky turned a deep orange over the horizon, the warning finally arrived. A small cargo ship, one that traveled between two settlements, sent a final message before its signal broke off. Only a few words reached the colonies, but they were enough to make everyone's heart drop. They found us. Everyone moved into action. The patrol ships launched into the sky, moving silently across the darkness. People in the settlements turned off lights, shut down unnecessary machines, and waited. A strange chill filled the air, the kind that comes before a storm. But this storm wasn't made of wind and rain. It was made of metal and danger. When the raiders finally appeared, they didn't come as a huge army. They came as scattered shadows, sleek ships with dark designs meant to scare, moving like predators testing their prey. They circled the settlements, looking for weakness. But instead of panicking, humans surprised them. The patrol ships did not hide. They flew straight toward the raiders, forming a defensive pattern they had practiced countless times. The raiders were confused at first. They expected fear. They expected chaos. But the humans fought with smart strategies, not brute force. Instead of chasing the raiders, the patrol ships trapped them by predicting their paths. They pushed the invaders into narrow parts of space near large asteroid fields where movement was difficult, but it wasn't an easy fight. The patrol ships shook from impacts, communication lines crackled, and the settlements felt the tremors of distant battle. But because humans worked as one, because each pilot trusted the next, they managed to force the raiders away from the colonies. What made the biggest difference, though, was something unexpected. Several independent rim species, ones who had traded with humans and respected their honesty, picked up the distress signals. They remembered how humans had helped them in the past, sharing tools, offering safe routes, and treating them as equals. Now, those species decided to return the kindness. Their ships arrived and joined the defense, forming a united front that the raiders didn't expect. Facing this alliance, the raiders retreated. They disappeared into the darkness they came from. The danger wasn't gone forever, but the colonies were safe for now. When the battle ended, the settlements didn't celebrate loudly. Instead, they came together quietly, checking on each other, repairing what was damaged, helping families who had been frightened. The children who had watched the sky glowing during the conflict were comforted by adults who reassured them that they were safe. This event changed everything. It made humans realize how strong they had become, not because of weapons, but because of unity, trust, and resilience. The independent species who helped them began visiting the settlements more often. Some offered friendship treaties, others suggested shared training programs, and a few even discussed building joint space stations in the rim. Humanity had not just survived the outer rim, they were becoming a pillar of stability in a place that had always been unstable. Their exile had pushed them far from the center of the galaxy, but now the rim itself was starting to look toward them for leadership. People talked about how far they had come, from being cast out and seen as a threat, to being respected by those who truly understood their struggles. The outer rim was no longer a punishment. It was becoming a home that humanity had shaped with its own hands. And even though new challenges were sure to come, the colonies were no longer afraid. They knew they could face anything as long as they stood together. The victory against the raiders was not just a defense. It was a message to the whole rim that humanity was no longer the fragile, exiled group it once was. They were rising, quietly, steadily, stronger every day, and soon. The entire galaxy would have no choice but to notice. After the raider attack had passed and peace slowly settled again, something strange began to happen across the outer rim. People noticed that their small communities, those simple settlements that began as struggling camps, were now turning into real towns. Ships landed daily. Markets expanded. New houses rose from dusty ground. The air felt busier, as if life itself had grown louder. For years, humans had focused only on surviving. But now, for the first time since exile, they had the chance to look beyond survival. They began asking new questions. What will our future look like? What will we build? What kind of people will we become? These questions moved quietly through every settlement. In workshops, in farms, in gathering halls, people discussed ideas that once felt impossible: schools, universities, research labs, trade hubs, and peaceful alliances with rim species. It was as if the entire population finally lifted its head and realized how far it had come. Still, no one on the rim expected what happened next. One morning, the central settlement received a message. It wasn't from a nearby colony. It wasn't from a friendly trader. It wasn't even from the raiders they had fought. It came from the Galactic Council, the same council that had exiled them. The same group that once saw humanity as a threat. The same powerful alliance that had turned its back on Earth. People gathered around screens and speakers, holding their breath. No one knew what the message would say. Some expected warnings, maybe even threats. Others thought it might be a mistake. But when the signal cleared, the words shocked everyone. The council requested a meeting. The message used careful language: official, formal, and distant. It almost sounded as if they were trying not to admit something directly. But people could read between the lines. The council had noticed what was happening in the outer rim. They had seen the growing settlements, the trade routes, the alliances with independent species, and the successful defense against the raiders. They had realized something important. Humanity was no longer weak, and that scared them. For days, the colonies debated what to do. They had no obligation to respond. They were no longer under council law. But ignoring the message might create misunderstandings. And humans didn't want war, not with raiders, not with rim species, and certainly not with the council. They had built their new home through hard work and cooperation, not aggression. So after long discussions, humanity decided to accept the request. They would attend the meeting, but this time they would not arrive as outcasts begging for fairness. They would arrive as equals. Preparations began immediately. Engineers polished the new long-distance ships. Diplomats practiced their words. Farmers donated fresh produce to supply the journey. Young volunteers checked oxygen systems, navigation tools, and medical kits, not because they expected trouble, but because rim life had taught everyone to be ready for anything. When the delegation finally left the rim, hundreds of people stood to watch the ships rise into the sky. There was no fear in their eyes. Only pride. The journey to the inner galaxy took many days. As the ships moved closer to the center, the stars grew brighter, the lanes busier, and the space stations larger. Many on board felt a strange mix of nostalgia and sadness. They remembered when humanity used to live here, before they were voted out, judged, and pushed to the edge of the galaxy. But their sadness did not come from weakness. It came from strength, the kind that grows when someone survives injustice and becomes stronger because of it. When their ships finally reached the council's main station, every sensor, every camera, every guard was watching. After years of silence, humanity had returned, but not the way anyone expected. The doors opened, and the human delegation stepped inside. Their clothes were simple but well made. Their posture was calm. Their eyes were steady. There was nothing aggressive about them, yet the entire hall felt tense. Representatives from many species turned to stare. They saw something they had not expected. These were not the desperate humans they once exiled. These were not the broken refugees they imagined. These were people who had survived the harshest parts of the galaxy and learned to thrive there. The council began, the meeting with long speeches, carefully chosen wording, and polished excuses. They did not apologize, but their tone carried unease. They said they wished to re-examine past decisions, discuss peaceful cooperation, and strengthen interspecies harmony. But everyone in the room understood the truth. Humanity's success in the rim had changed the balance of the galaxy dot. After listening quietly, the human representative finally stood. The entire hall fell silent. No one knew what he would say. Some expected anger. Others expected demands. The council braced themselves, but the representative surprised everyone. He didn't accuse them. He didn't complain. He didn't ask to be welcomed back. He simply explained what humanity had built. He spoke about the settlements, how people grew their own food, developed new technology, and created schools for children who had never seen Earth. He talked about how humans helped rim species, not because they wanted power, but because they understood hardship. He described how the colonies defended themselves without hurting anyone unnecessarily. He mentioned how different communities shared resources and knowledge. He told the truth. When he finished, the room stayed quiet for a long time. It took the council several minutes to respond. Their faces showed confusion, curiosity, and something else, something like respect. They had expected a broken people. They had found a rising civilization dot. The discussions continued for hours. The council offered new agreements. They suggested trade. They offered access to certain routes. But the human delegation answered calmly each time. We don't need permission to survive. We don't need special treatment. We only want peace and freedom to grow. The council representatives exchanged uncertain glances. They were used to dealing with nations that wanted power, protection, or territory. But humanity asked for none of that. They simply wanted to continue building the life they had created in the rim. And that made them even harder to ignore Dot in the end. The meeting ended without drama. No threats. No shouting. No tears. The humans left just as calmly as they arrived. They didn't bow, and they didn't look back. They simply walked through the halls with the quiet confidence of people who had already found their path. When they returned to the rim, the people welcomed them with warm smiles and open arms. The children ran alongside the landing ships, waving small lights. Elderly settlers leaned on canes, proud of how far their people had come. And as the delegation shared everything that happened, a deep sense of peace settled across every settlement. Humanity no longer needed the council's acceptance. They no longer needed a seat in a hall far away. They no longer needed to explain themselves to anyone. They had built their own home strong, free, and respected. In the months that followed, the rim continued to grow. New stations were constructed. A shared research center was launched with help from friendly rim species. A massive trade port opened near the outer nebula, connecting dozens of independent communities. Whether the council liked it or not, humanity had become a stabilizing force in a region long, filled with chaos. And then came the moment that would be remembered for generations. The first human-built star, station larger than anything they had ever created, lit up in the darkness of space. It wasn't just a station. It was a symbol. A bright tower of light standing on the edge of the galaxy, shining proudly into the vastness. People from every colony watched as its lights turned on one by one. Families stood together on rooftops. Workers paused in factories. Farmers looked up from their fields. Children pressed their hands against glass windows. Some cried softly. Some smiled. Some whispered prayers. Some simply stared, unable to speak. That station wasn't built by a powerful empire. It wasn't built by a wealthy society. It wasn't built by people who were welcome God. It was built by the exiled, the outsiders, the ones who were pushed away. Humans. Their exile had not broken them. It had shaped them. It had sharpened them. It had given them a chance to rise in a way no one ever expected. And as the new station's light spread across the rim, one thing became clear. Humanity had not just survived the outer rim. Humanity had conquered it by building, not destroying, by cooperating, not dominating, by choosing hope over anger. The galaxy would never look at them the same way again. And this time, that change was earned.